Okay, I hit the go live button. Can y'all hear me okay? I'm still waiting for my screen to show on Rumble. Let me know if y'all can hear me. Yes, okay, we're going to get going. So, first of all, I haven't had a live stream since the whole Israeli um, attack. Um, and I know several of y'all have seen what I had to say about it um, on True Social or Twitter, X. And I think, had I not been made aware of Operation Gladio, I would have fell in the same bucket with several other people in the comments about what's been going on. So I understand. Again, I say this every single live stream, I think, how difficult it is to get your head around how evil people can be. People in government, people in organizations that we have been taught our whole life is above reproach. But at this point, based on the 18 chapters that we've went through, I don't think we can exclude any action that that is so heinous that it would be outside the possibility of an intel agency or a government, because we've implicated just about every government and their affiliation with killing their own people time after time after time. So I definitely have to have caution. We already see the telltale signs of the seeding of information, the seeding of a narrative, the whole dead body of babies come out. And it just so happens to be 33 years to the date of when the the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. daughter goes on international television telling everybody that they were dumping babies out of incubators in Kuwait. So you really have to be very cautious in forming an opinion within the first 24 hours, the first 48 hours, because the majority of the narratives in near real time now get shot down. And I really think that is the key to the hope that everybody has right now is how long. I mean, I realize the several comments made right after 9/11, but how long did it take for us to really get our heads around um, the absurdity of the stuff that we were told? Yeah, some people got it right away, but we were not all networked together. We were not able to build on each other's research. And thanks to a few operations, we now are all networked together, and somebody can say something and immediately somebody else adds something else to it. And I think that's the beauty of the group that we have on Truth Social, quite frankly. Y'all are amazing. Um, we start down a road both with hidden histories, and the third way came out of doing hidden histories. Y'all, somebody suggested that I read that book. I bought the book and I read it. And, you know, that book review was crazy. And it brought to light Operation Gladio. I'd never heard of it. And I'm telling you, I'm just left San Antonio. A lot of my military friends retired there. And I've not met a single person yet that knows anything about Operation Gladio. And we all have, almost all of us, 30 years experience. I have another friend that's a surface warfare guy that I spoke at link with just recently. He's been embedded in, he's an Air Force guy, but embedded in Air Force, or excuse me, in Army units, deployed the majority of his last 20 years. He's been deployed to some crisis spot. Never heard of Operation Gladio. So we definitely have a lot of educating to go on. And for anybody new joining us, I just want to say, in a nutshell, Operation Gladio began formally in 1942. It existed prior to that, under Galen, a Nazi German, control inside of Germany, and it was embedded in all of the Axis areas for later use as stay behind units. And once he convinced Alan Dulles to take the program over, in exchange for allowing him to stay as the chief of intel in the new Adenauer government in Germany. Yes, the former Nazi was the chief of intel for the new supposedly non-Nazi German government. Alan Dulles kind of took it to that next level. He embedded stay behind units in all of NATO, and they used the auspices of NATO to meet on a every 3 or 4 month basis. So when it was all exposed in 1990-91, a lot of the European NATO members tried to say, oh, I don't know anything about that. But the guy that got caught red-handed in Italy exposed them all by saying, oh, yes, you were. We just had a meeting last month and you were there. So there's so much documentation when you do any search on Operation Gladio. It just blows my mind that it's been hiding in plain sight all of this time. And basically what it is, stay behind units, terror cells, set up with stashes of weapons, money, and communication capability. So they can be activated at any time by anyone in the network, and they're given an operation, whether it's to assassinate somebody, whether it's to kidnap somebody, whether it's to poison somebody in a prison, whether it's to stage a terror attack. And it was done by the government, like the government of Italy, the chief of intel, General Santavito, part of the Masons, part of P2, part of the network, and he would just activate it. They would have a bombing at a train station just before they were going to have an election of something, and it was to terrorize people and to keep them submissive, give up safety for control. So, and many of y'all have seen my post, the Get Smart, which is my husband, just one day went, hey, do you realize that's chaos and control under Get Smart? So they're telling you, me, to get smart. And they're telling you right to your face that program had chaos and control. That's what they do. They create chaos to control us. That is exactly, in my humble opinion, what is happening in Italy, or in Israel. Y'all realize that they have had a lot of disruption and people. There was a lot of internal problems after how controlling they were with the COVID narrative. And Israel became the most vaccinated country in the world. I have my own theories about that. We're not going to get into that tonight, but there were a lot of people. And then you have the whole Netanyahu, and we heard what Trump said about him, that he basically kind of screwed Trump on the Iranian Soleimani takeout. And yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff going on there. We don't know all of what's going on there, but would I, at this point, after reading about Operation Gladio, and we're going to talk about it tonight, put it past a government to kill their own people to further their agenda? Absolutely not. We have seen every single country in Europe, whether it was Spain, Portugal, Germany, Italy, all of them. They've all done it. So they're all capable of, we know our government did it. governments all over South America did it. So, and if they wouldn't do it, the prime minister or president was assassinated by Gladio units, and they installed somebody who would. So all of them out there is capable of it. So let me read a couple of the comments. No coincidence. You're absolutely right. Operation Gladio helps expose the propaganda. Yep. Yeah, exactly. All right. So let's get into it. So where we left off last time, we have the Calvi, who was another Vatican bank slash Ambrosiano bank. He actually ran the Ambrosiano bank in Italy, but he tied his bank into the Vatican Bank by making loans to the Vatican Bank, which then they created shell companies. They used that money to launder back in to buy control of Calvi's bank, so that it would end up with the Vatican owning over 20% of the bank that Calvi was running. And they assassinated his secretary, threw out the window of the bank. They hung Calvi in a Masonic ritualistic hanging off the bridge, the Blackfriar Bridge, which is what the Masons in Italy in the P2 were known as, Blackfriars. So there's a bridge in London, weirdly enough, that's called Blackfriar. They hung Calvi from that with masonry rocks in his pocket. So we know that it was a murder. It was initially ruled as a suicide, but eventually a second jury said that they were unable to decide whether he was actually murdered. But eventually it was determined that he was murdered. So, and if you kind of get the picture of where this bridge is, he was supposed to, I mean, he was huge. Okay. He was not a skinny guy. He was 62 years old. He was supposed to have climbed up on scaffolding and then basically hung himself, which when you looked at the way the whole thing was set up, there's no way he could have done that. He later, his body was exhumed in 1998, and it was determined that he had been strangled first. So it was then classified as a murder. In the wake of this reclassification, there's a guy called Frank the Strangler, Di Carlo, who was also a heroin traffic manager for the Sicilian mafia. And he testified that he had been approached to kill Calvi by members of the mafia. And there's a quote in here that basically says, "I was in Rome, received a phone call from a friend in Sicily telling me a certain high-ranking mafia member had just been killed. I will never forget the date because it was 16 June 1982, 2 days before Calvi was murdered. The friend told me that he was trying to get a hold of me because he needed me to do something for him. He was a general. I was basically a colonel. And while I spoke to him, he told me not to worry. Everything had been taken care of, that Calvi was naming names and no one trusted it anymore. So basically he had to go." So he says, I wasn't the one that hung Calvi, but we know that anybody that talks in this circle of crime gets knocked off, whether it's a reporter or anybody in the network. So we go on and find out that Di Carlo and two members of a mafia that had ties to the Masons had received the contract for Calvi's murder from Gelli. And Gelli is the guy that is the Graham Poobah of the P2 Masons in all of Italy. So the two people that got the call were killed in a car bomb shortly after their return to Milan. So also one of them's mistress was also murdered. So you can bet those are the guys that took out Calvi, because they like to, just like with what's his name, Rich, they like to, if you're going to have MS-13, which is the whole reason they're here, carry out your hits, then you got to kill them after they do that. And then nobody cares because they're here illegally anyway and they're gangs. So, two dead gang members isn't looked into. And the same thing with the mafia. If you kill a couple of mafia guys, good on you. You just buried the truth of their complicity in a different murder, but, whatever. So that's kind of the way this vicious circle works. So after the Calvi affair, the mob is basically still doing money laundering with the Vatican Bank of the drug money. And for anyone new, the whole drug apparatus works that they move it from, Vietnam or right now, currently in the book, it's in the Golden Triangle, which is Turkey, northern Iraq, and northern Iran. And they're ferrying the drugs down to Sicily, turning it into heroin and shipping it over to the United States primarily. And they're using the money that they generate from the sale of it in the United States. It's laundered back through the Vatican Bank and BCCI in Pakistan to buy weapons, to fund the Gladio operations. So they've got this nice little circle all worked out. The drugs are being imported into New York and New Jersey into the mafia. So we also figured out another riddle. So we had talked for several days about what was the significance of oranges in The Godfather. Because if you go back and you rewatch now that you know about Gladio, Godfather 1, 2, and 3, it's going to blow your mind. Because there's so much built into those films that there are several characters in there that are actually in Operation Gladio. They're basically taken off of those characters. So somebody, Julie, had made the comment about oranges every time somebody's murdered, and it's all over the internet. It's not a new thing, but every time somebody's about to die or whatever, there's oranges in the room. And so we were kind of batting back and forth. And Calvi is hung with an orange noose. So what's the significance of orange? We were looking in Satan things. We were looking up all kinds of different things, trying to find out what the significance of orange was. Well, I just happened today to go back and look at the beginning of our book, and oranges were used, plastic oranges in crates of real oranges were used to hide the heroin coming into the ports in New York to the mafia, of which The Godfather is a derivative of. So you go back and you look at the people who directed The Godfather, tied into the mob. I mean, it's like they're telling you the story of what they were actually doing. And so they're using to fund Operation Gladio these heroin in oranges. And while the gangsters in The Godfather are doing all the drug dealing and all of the other stuff, they've got the oranges right there in front of you. Just crazy. So we were able to figure out that mystery. So back to the story. So we get to basically no murder or contract group had been more useful to the P2 Masons and the commanders of Operation Gladio than street gangs that were in northern Rome, and they're the ones that were involved in the kidnapping and murdering of the Prime Minister of Italy, Aldo Moro, the murder of the journalist that we talked about, Pecorelli, who published the list of the P2 people. And this same group had also been responsible for a judge being murdered, the guy that was in charge of the investigation of Sedona, and his dealings with the Gelly Masonic Lodge. He'd been murdered. A lieutenant colonel in the Carabinieri, the security service, he had been murdered. So there's just murder after murder after murder. The Banda, which is the name of this portion of the mafia in Italy, was responsible for detonating the bomb in the home of another guy that was at Medio Banca, which is a bank, who had witnessed Sedona's threat to the life of Ambrosio Soli, and the attempted hit on Roberta Rizzoni, which we talked about last video. After participating in the murder of Calvi, the gang tossed an executive of Ambrosiano to his death from the top floor of the Milan Bank. That was another one. That's not the secretary. That's yet another guy they've thrown out a window. And what's interesting about that is if you look at some of the banking executives over the last year that supposedly jumped out of windows, whether it's the JP Morgan guy or the guy that was over in London, there's a lot of people flying out of bank windows to their death. And every single one of them, when you look them up, they all have something to do with like internal audits, like where you would find money laundering. And all of them have that in common. And so, in my opinion, there's people who find out way too much and all of a sudden their body's flying out of a window, which is another replication of Operation Gladio. Don't know if they're connected, but I wouldn't say they're not. The killings could not repair the damage caused to Operation Gladio by the Ambrosiano affairs and the obstinate Pope and his inability to basically try to make amends to the people that were injured in. So just in case you weren't following, Ambrosiano was a bank that they basically destroyed in its interaction with the Vatican in this money laundering. And the Pope was asked, John Paul II, to make it right, and he refused because he didn't want to risk any money going to Solidarity in Poland, which is where he was from. So he basically facilitated the unfolding or exposure of all of this by his inability to right a wrong that was definitely a wrong, because they embezzled all these people's money. So in 1981, they published the list of the Masons that, I mean, like 900 people in the government of Italy that was all in the Masonic Lodge. A significant portion of them was in the Catholic Church, which forbids you to be a Mason member. So when that list was published, you remember that Gelli was forced to flee the country. So he went a couple of different places. He ends up in South America. The most notably was Mino Piccarelli in his newspaper that had published that list. Many mainstream reporters had dismissed the stories as part of yellow journalism, but he had published that list. The fears of the CIA came into full fruition. John Paul II's refusal to shore up the losses of the Vatican shell companies had resulted in exposure of the P2 Masons, the raid on Stybom, which is the arms smuggling company that was embedded in Ambrosiano, the bank, Ambrosia, and the collapse of the ruling party in Italy. So the whole prime minister's government fell apart. So it also exposed the Carabinieri that to the realization that for every bombing that had happened in Italy as a result of Operation Gladio, the Red Brigades, which was the communist element of Italy, had been blamed, when in fact it was 100% the Operation Gladio under the guise of or under the control of the Mason P2 organization, to include the chief of intel of the Italian government military, that was responsible for every single one of them. He also uncovered the evidence of the funding for the Masons and its strategy of tension, which is another name, if you hear that, for Operation Gladio, was coming from a heroin pipeline that had been established between Sicily and the US. That's what I was just mentioning, along with a letter from Aldo Moro that mentioned the presence of NATO guerrilla activities on Italian soil, Operation Gladio. When one of the members reported these findings to the prime minister, he went white in the face. His worst fears were coming true. Operation Gladio was beginning to unravel. So one of the generals in the Italian military arrived in Palermo in 1982 as the new prefect of Sicily. 2 days later, he met with Ralph Jones, the U.S. consul, and informed him that the Gambino those are the New York guys, and the rest of the families that were in Italy's mafia clan and the P2 Masons were involved in a heroin smuggling racket, netting a profit of nearly 900 million annually. Netting, that was their take home. Word was passed to the FBI, and the extended Gambino crime family in New York and New Jersey were put under constant surveillance. On September 3rd, the general and his 32-year-old wife was murdered by a team of 6 assassins. Again, that's what happened every single time one element of the Operation Gladio was exposed. 1 month after Calvi's death, commissioners from the Bank of Italy appeared at the Vatican Bank to confront Archbishop Marcinkus. And keep in mind, Marcinkus was the Chicago Archbishop prior to being reassigned to be in charge of the Vatican Bank because Sedona's gone. And so now he's going to be in charge. And he was the one that was working with the Bank of Ambrosia and Ambrosiano and Calvi. So he's dirty, totally dirty, Marcinkus. So now they want to talk to him. Most of the $1.75 billion that remained missing, Marcinkus had written that letter that we talked about a couple of times ago, that basically said all of those dummy corporations that Calvi set up was under the control of because he was getting a lot of heat for missing money. So the Vatican wrote a letter to Calvi saying, no, all of those things are fine. They're all under the Vatican. We've got it covered. They're ours. What they didn't tell anybody was there was a secret letter that Calvi wrote back to Marcinkus that no one knew about that said basically the Bank of Ambrosiano was basically forgiving the Vatican Bank of any indebtedness as a result of this whole organization. So that's where Calvi got himself in trouble, because there was no way to get the money back now. And Pope John Paul II decided he wasn't going to give it back. So that whole thing gets exposed. The Italian government maintains pressure because they want to talk to Marcinkus. But basically they say, hey, we're sovereign, and you can't basically talk to any of the people here. So the guy that basically was the Vatican Secretary of State proposed to create a 6-man commission to do an investigation because they were getting so much heat by the Italian government on the Vatican's involvement in the bank. So they have 3 Italian Ministry of Treasury people on there, and they also had 3 people that was named by the Vatican. But basically, they could not come to any conclusion because nobody in the 3 that were there from the Vatican was not going to give them any information about exposing themselves. So the Ambrosiano creditors continue to mount the pressure. They want a settlement of the $1.75 billion that's missing. The Italian government was left with no option save to mount a criminal investigation into the Vatican shell game. They unearthed records in Switzerland that ties the Vatican Bank to it. They also reveal that the Vatican Bank had set up and controlled dummy corporations to plunder the assets of the Milan Bank, Ambrosiano, and that the Vatican officials actually signed paperwork that was a request for a Swiss bank to be opened on behalf of the newly created company, one of the 8 shell companies. And so they have like the smoking gun that ties the Vatican into the whole money laundering and failure of Ambrosiano. So the other documents found revealed more acts of fraud by the Vatican Bank. They had received 2 deposits from one of the money laundering banks in Peru. The deposits there were 2 deposits for $69 million each. When they matured in 1982, they wanted the money back. They were like CDs, if you will. And the Vatican Bank wouldn't give them their money back. So they basically just stole that money. Since the Pope refused to acknowledge that the Vatican's ownership of those shell companies, and he thought, the Pope did, that an admission of it would reveal that they're no longer pure. Well, they're not pure because they were messing in the crap to begin with, but they have this image that they want to protect. So going forward, we've got June 1983, we have Emanuela Orlandi, the 15-year-old daughter of a Vatican employee. She just disappears out of thin air. She was last seen entering a BMW, a well-dressed man whose witnesses said bore striking resemblance to one of the Banda mafia groups. But they later find out the BMW belonged to a guy by the name of Flavio Carboni, which we've talked about before. So 2 weeks later, the Orlandi family receives a call from a man with a heavy American accent. And he says that we have taken Orlandi, the girl, only because she belongs to the Vatican state, that they're not a terror organization. We're only interested in liberating the would-be papal assassin Adka. So Adka is the Turkish guy that tried to take out John Paul II in St. Peter's Square. So he's basically blaming the Turkish Gladio, because Adka is a Turkish Gladio guy, for kidnapping somebody from the Vatican Bank property, this young girl. So, and they basically make up the name of an organization that no one's never heard of before. Several days later, Emanuela's father paid a visit to one of the Vatican officials to see if a message had arrived about the fate of his daughter. He initially says no, but says that no one's heard from him. But he actually finally admits that yes, they had. There had been a call and a message, but absolutely nothing they say or wanted could be understood. So basically, they're leaving this little girl out to dry. For another week, Americans make calls, some directing press. They find notes and tape messages from the little girl. The mysterious caller contacts one of the national news and says, "This is the last day. This is our ultimatum." So basically, throughout this entire investigation, the Italian intelligence entity found that the Vatican was strangely uncooperative and unwilling to share conversations of the American that was supposedly making these phone calls. So they find there's a campaign of sophisticated disinformation. That's an interesting term The messages and calls from the supposed Turkish organization were basically like play acting to distract attention. So the foreigner, very possible of Anglo-Saxon culture, very intelligent, culturally very familiar with Latin tongue. It says that basically they're trying to come up with all of these characteristics and to describe this person that supposedly is trying to contact these people. So says that the intelligence officials in Italy says it's very plausible that the kidnapping of Emanuela was committed by someone inside the Catholic Church who was closely connected to organized crime figures. That's what comes out. So it was basically a staged event to distract from the fact that all of this information was coming out, that it was to give a sympathy card, if you will, to the Vatican of them having had this happen to them in the middle of a that they were in the middle of because of the bank failures. So when they came looking for the information of the tape recordings of the calls and everything, they're all gone. So the Carabinieri tapped the phone of one of the officials at the Vatican. In one of the taped conversations, Bonarelli said that he had sent boxes of documents on the Orlandi case to the office of the Cardinal Casaroli, and they had sent requests to the Holy See asking permission to interview the members of the Secretary of State's office. All requests were denied. In the Vatican, the prevailing opinion is that the people responsible for the kidnapping belong to the world of common crime, and that the proposal for an exchange with AGCA is just an excuse to extort considerable sums from the Vatican in exchange for the girl to throw off the investigators. The judge estimated the amount owed to the gang was in excess of $200 million. So you have the Vatican Bank basically stiffing another organized crime entity, and as a result, this girl gets kidnapped. So years later, one of the mafia people says that his boss had arranged the kidnapping in order to recoup the millions that had been lost in the collapse of Ambrosiano. There was money that had gone missing, and the choice was between dropping a cardinal by the roadside or striking someone close to the Pope. We chose the second option. What the judge says about the Orlandi kidnapping is the absolute truth. What puzzles me is the figure of 200 million. Knowing the amount that flowed from the gang's activity, it was actually a lot more money. Critical insight into the possible fate of Emanuela came from Sabrina Minardi, the former lover of one of this gang members. She was also a high-class call girl. Emanuela testified that the girl had been kidnapped, held in her apartment in a coastal town not far from Rome. Archbishop Marcinkus, the call girl said, visited Emanuela several times while the schoolgirl remained in captivity. The victim, she continued, was eventually killed and chopped into pieces, and her remains mixed in a cement mixer. In a 2010 interview, Minardi said that she had ongoing sexual relations with Roberto Calvi, that's the Ambrosiano Bank president that was hung on the Blackfriar Bridge, and Archbishop Marcinkus. She claimed that she had received a villa in Monte Carlo from Calvi, while Marcinkus provided a Vatican position for one of her relatives for her sexual services. Miss Minardi added that she had provided Marcinkus with a steady stream of prostitutes and had delivered to him large sums of money from the gang in a Louis Vuitton bag. I gave him the money and I kept the bag. As a result, Mrs. Marnini's testimony, Roman prosecutors arrested 3 underworld associates of this gang for kidnapping and murder, and she identified them as the individuals who had assisted the guy in arranging the kidnapping of the young girl. So eventually, the investigating judges obtained evidence that the Vatican had made the payoff to the banda in a circuitous manner. So they wanted their money, and the Vatican wouldn't give it to them. So this banda gang kidnapped this little girl and kills her. But the Vatican ends up giving them their money in this round robin way of doing it. And it ended up being not a whole lot of money compared to what they eventually actually owed them. But they basically, the Vatican Bank basically ended up giving this gang money. So thanks to the sale of, they sold a villa, and then supposedly the proceeds were to be given to the bank. At the time of the kidnapping, had returned a great deal of adverse publicity, both on Gelly, the head Mason guy, but there was an interesting new element called Opus Dei. So a Opus Dei is a secretive Catholic sect that had served to establish Gladio units throughout Europe. I did a little bit of research on that, and it's actually a very interesting organization. It was founded in Spain while Spain was under a fascist dictator. And it, no offense here, I apologize in advance. I'm just telling you what I think. I've done a lot of research into Scientology and how their members basically give up large portions of their income to the church. This is what Opus Dei does too. It's not like nunneries or there are priests in it, but it's basically made up of normal people and that are Catholics, and 30% of them live in like a communal situation. 70% of them can be single or married, but they live in normal houses, have normal jobs. They just give inordinate amount of their income to this organization, and this organization is worth like hundreds of billions of dollars. It was given initial approval in 1950 by Pope Pius XII, which we've also talked about in here. He had a lot to do with Gladio. He was very familiar that they were laundering money. Also, interestingly enough, John Paul II, who we're talking about right now, he's Pope right now as we talk. He made it a personal prelature, whatever that means in Catholic. It's an official institution of the Catholic Church. And Pope Francis issued a letter, I'll just say that, that basically moved up its status into the Catholic Church. But there has been lots of controversy because even within the Catholic Church, it is by a Jesuit superior general, whatever that is in the Catholic Church vernacular. He said it is a secret organization or a secret society, and it is basically a form of Christian masonry. That's what somebody inside the church said. That's not my words. And it really does sound like that. So there's no list of who's in it. So it is secret from that perspective. So just a very interesting aside as we're talking about the Masons being a part of this whole money laundering Operation Gladio network and the Catholic Church. And then you find that the Catholic Church basically has embedded in its entity, in its own folds, if you will, a Masonic-like organization called Opus Dei. So in 1983, when that villa was sold to try to generate the money to pay back the mobsters, the banda, organized crime people, investigators, including a judge, had come to the conclusion that the kidnapping case revolved around sex and the problem of pedophilia that was mounting inside the Vatican. If the matter was simply financial, Archbishop Marcinkus would have provided the restitution. If the matter was political, the resolution would have been made by Cardinal Casaroli, the Secretary of State. But the extortion appeared to revolve around a considerably more sinister episode. Rumors had been rampant about Archbishop Marcinkus' taste for young girls and sex parties in his private apartments. And so, what they actually believed, and keep in mind, this is in 1983, they basically, a scenario was gradually compiled that served to explain the kidnapping, the Vatican's attempts at obstruction, and the payoff. Emanuela, by this account, had been sexually molested by Marcinkus. When the Banda group, the Mafia, received news of the incident, they kidnapped the girl in order to blackmail the Vatican for the money that they had lost through the bank failure that they were part of. Exposure of statutory rape would have been devastated in the wake of the Sedona episode, which implicated the Vatican as well, the P2 headlines, which implicated the Vatican as well, the shell companies, which implicated the Vatican, and the and the murder of Calvi, which implicated the Vatican. So Emanuela represented a $200 million baby. Marcinkus, after personally verifying that the girl was in the Banda's custody, worked through the Masonic P2 and a cardinal not to secure her immediate release, but to ensure her perpetual silence. That's what they found. On February 2nd, 1990, Enrico de Pitas was gunned down and killed on a street in Rome. He was buried in a diamond-studded tomb within the Basilica Apollinari, a place reserved for popes and cardinals. Perhaps the gangster merited this interment. He had participated in the killing of Calvi, made peace between the Vatican and the mob by accepting the real estate deal as the cash payment for the money that they felt had been lost by the bank failure, and prevented a 15-year-old schoolgirl from creating a scandal that would have rocked the foundation of the Vatican. His place among the saints and other dignitaries was sanctioned by Cardinal Pallotti. In 2006, an anonymous caller, someone called into an Italian current events program and said, "Do you want to solve the Emanuela Orlandi case? Then look inside the tomb of De Pitas," who was basically the guy that got the gold-studded burial. On May 14, 2010, that's 4 years later, the Italian forensic examiners opened the tomb in response to the widespread public demand. They discovered that the body of De Pitas remained well preserved. His remains dressed in a dark blue suit with a black tie. Next to his coffin, they found 200 boxes of bones, which appeared to date from pre-Napoleonic times. They remain under examination. What the hell? That's gross. Moving on. And I haven't done any follow up on that. If somebody wants to look into that, I'd love it. Um, but yeah, what the heck? So they take the opportunity to bury this guy, who obviously was involved in murdering a 15-year-old on behalf of the Vatican Church. And they find 200 boxes of bones. How freaking big was where he was buried? Okay, moving on. Next chapter. We're up to May 1984. We have the goodwill payment of 250 million made by the Vatican to Ambrosiano creditors at the headquarters of the European Trade Association in Geneva, Switzerland. The money was for reparations that came from a mysterious deposit made at the Vatican by Secretary of State Casaroli in the amount of $406 million. The source of the cash was Opus Dei. So all of those hardworking people giving up all of their salaries for Opus Dei just had $406 million taken out of their deposits into this secret organization and basically used as a goodwill reparations payment for the embezzling of funds from the Bank Ambrosiano. The source of the cash, and Opus Dei stands for Work of God. That's what it stands for. And as of 1984, when this payment was made, they were up to $3 billion in assets. So the organization assumed the debt of the parochial banks within the Ambrosiano group, to include those other money laundering banks that had been set up as part of that. They got that special status from John Paul II as a personal prelature. This status ensured that the secret society would answer only to the Pope and the Pope alone. No local bishop could ever discipline or sanction it. So overnight, they were elevated within the Catholic Church as a result of this payoff they made on behalf of the Vatican Bank. And it goes on to talk about, which we've already talked about a little bit, the Opus Dei was founded in 1928 by a lawyer in Spain. Oh, and yeah, I forgot about this part. So their daily ritual is mass, devotional readings, private prayer, and physical mortification, which they define as self-flagellation with whips and chains to subdue the flesh. Are you kidding me? What in the world? Within the order, they make a commitment of celibacy and live within the centers, which we talked about. And that's only maybe 30% of the group. The other ones are called supernumeraries, and they're married, they maintain their private domicile, but they do give large portions of their salaries to the organization. So much of what is known about this Opus Dei came from John Roach, a professor at Oxford University, who left the order and broke his pledge of secrecy, because you're not allowed to ever talk about, you have to swear to be in it, that you won't ever talk about anything that goes on the inside, secret society, and you will never name anybody else that's in the society, secret society. So he writes, the inner world of Opus Dei, internally it is totalitarian and imbued the fascist ideas turned to religious purposes, the ideas which is surely drawn from Spain in its early years. Because at the time it was created, Franco was the Spanish dictator after all of the years of civil war that went on. This is this organization began and thrived in a fascist dictatorship. It is virtually an occult in spirit, a law unto itself, totally self centered, grudgingly accepting Roman authority because it still considers Rome orthodox. Opus Dei had become a $3 billion enterprise controlling 600 newspapers, 52 radios and television stations, 12 film companies, 38 news organizations. Prominent Americans who affiliated with this movement are CIA Director William Casey, William Simon of Citicorp, Francis X. Stankard of Chase Manhattan, and Sargent Shriver, a former Democratic candidate for vice president. David Kennedy, although he's a Mormon, he still was affiliated with this. And if you remember, David Kennedy worked at Continental Illinois, which when Marcinkus was the Archbishop in Chicago, all of the billions of dollars of the Chicago Archbishop organization use Continental Illinois and David Kennedy as their banker. So he's been partners with Marcinkus for a very long time. And it's also said that David Kennedy is a leading shareholder in an Opus Dei bank in Barcelona, Spain. So all one big happy family. The CIA began to funnel millions into the coffers of Opus Dei because it actually fought against liberation theology in Latin America. At least that's the excuse they used. Much of the money ended up in the Chilean Institute of General Studies, which is an Opus Dei think tank. So members of this think tank were responsible for, they owned several magazines and publishers in Santiago, and one of the newspapers that it owned got CIA subsidies as well. So the coup that happened in Chile, where they overthrew Allende's presidency, duly elected, and installed the dictator there, all came out of the Opus Dei think tank there. Throughout the 1980s, the CIA made use of Opus Dei as a primary force in Poland because they were big in the movement for the support for solidarity, which actually makes a lot of sense because remember that the whole reason John Paul II wouldn't do anything to stop the money laundering and the drug trafficking is because he was skimming the Vatican's 10 to 15% usury cut of the money laundering into solidarity to fund their resistance against the Soviets. So that kind of all makes sense when you think about it. And why, if Opus Dei is giving the Pope also money to support solidarity, why John Paul II would then give them a special status in return. So the amount of money that poured into solidarity reached nearly $1 billion by the end of the decade. Opus Dei had organized all kinds of courses, seminars, conferences for the Polish teachers, scholars, and economists on the tenets of Western democracy and basically how to run the government. And they did so in plans to unify Europe, which was envisioned by the Council of Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission because they knew that the USSR was pending collapse. And you remember at the very start of this, we talked about both in the Third Way, the pan-European EU common trade Um, that's all part of this. And so it folds right in that that's exactly what's going on. They want Poland, they're using Poland as kind of the wedge into the Eastern, formerly held Soviet countries in order to pull them into the European Union and make it as easy a transition as they can. And it seems like everybody's on board. You got Opus Dei, you've got the um, Operation Gladio elements, all of it, all of NATO, basically. So, and of course, the how much money the CIA provided Opus Dei remains a mystery. The CIA refused to release any records regarding its relationship to the secret sect on the grounds that it would undermine national security. Imagine that. So that's interesting. As plans got underway for Opus Dei to take control of the Vatican's finances in order to ward off any future debacle, the CIA was forced to bring closure to other matters, including the case of Michele Sedona, the man that knew too much. So Sedona, he's sitting in jail because they were prosecuting him in New York, and he was the banker before Marcinkus. Sedona basically had that job before Marcinkus. So he's rotting away in a jail. He asked Reagan for a presidential pardon, and he's basically given the cold shoulder, and they're not going to do anything for him. David Kennedy, the guy from Chicago who's friends with Marcinkus, was Nixon's former Secretary of the Treasury. Yeah, the guy that's doing the banking for the Archbishop in Illinois, Chicago. So he was longtime friends with Sedona. He took a letter to the White House asking for parole and pardon. And Sedona waited for over a year. He heard nothing. Then he reached out to Nixon, and Nixon basically said, "Look, I could only hurt you. My help would not be any help at all." So he gets no help there. In addition to 25 years in prison for his role in the collapse of another bank called Franklin National, Sedona had been sentenced on April 20th in 81 to 2.5 years for jail jumping and perjury. And the Gambinos were unindicted co-conspirators in that court case. The discovery of Sedona had spent several weeks in the villa of Rosario Spatola's father-in-law in Italy, not far from Palermo. The Spatolas, the prosecutors came to realize, were one of the 4 mafia families that made this whole transatlantic deal work. And it goes on to list them all. But the important part of this thing is that it's a network. The majority of them were all in the P2 Masonic Lodge. In Palermo, Kenny, the Illinois bank guy and company, came to learn that one of the Sicilian leading heroin smugglers was also part of this whole mafia family. That he had relatives married to the Spatolas, and there were cousins and married to Gambinos, and basically the whole incestuous. So the prosecutor says the 4 families form a single clan unlike anything in Italy or the United States. So basically he's just outlining the whole drug operation, and they stumble across it because they're looking into Sedona's fake kidnapping that he staged himself. And so during his stay in Sicily, Kenny and his fellow prosecutors received word of Salvatore Incirilla's latest heroin shipment to New York. They contacted the agents of the DEA, who intercept 5 kilos of heroin packed in talcum powder meant for the Gambinos. The next shipment came from Sicily, which was a truckload of lemons this time, not oranges, lemons, um, which had been driven to Milan, packed in cargo containers, and shipped also to the Gambinos in New York. The second shipment reached the U.S. The police moved in. They bust the Gambinos. The man and woman, John and Rosario, were arrested in the restaurant and supposedly for participation in international heroin smuggling. But guess what happens? They're both acquitted. Isn't that odd? Those are the guys running the operation. They're acquitted. But 60 members of the Sicilian mafia are eventually convicted in the case. They always get the low guys, not the high guys. And that's why you find what's very interesting about this whole Antifa, the BLM, and all of them. Their little street thugs are going to go to jail eventually. You know who's not going to go to jail? Is the people that control it. So the bust in New York provided profound repercussions in Sicily. A substantial amount of the confiscated heroin belonged to the Corleones crime family in Sicily. And they were not happy. So they go to the other crime family and says, hey, I want reimbursed for my loss. And he basically says, I'm not going to give you anything. Well, then they start shooting. And they kill one of the guys at a traffic light. They kill another guy. Then another guy's leaving his mistress's house. They shoot him dead. At the end of the day, over 200 members of this extended crime family were killed as a result of that drug bust in New York. And that crime family not reimbursing the other crime family for the payment that they should have gotten for the sloppy work on the New York end. So, thanks in part to the antics of Sedona, the Klan had lost the protection of the Italian government and the overlords of Gladio. By the end of 1982, 72 of this mafia group went on trial in Palermo. Warrants were issued for over 50 more of them. To top it off, the multi-billion-dollar Gambino holdings were seized by the state. Sedona had lost his family, and the mafia financier, Sedona, continued to get, he was charged with $1 million a year heroin business between Sicily and the U.S., which he had. He was also charged with illegal possessions of firearms, false passport, violating currency regulations. He was indicted for ordering an execution of a chief bank investigator. He was indicted in Palermo, Sicily, 75 other members of the Gambino crime family. This indictment sprang from his ill-fated kidnapping. And in 1982, after the raid on Gelli's villa, where they come up with the list of all the P2 members, and the collapse of the Ambrosiano Bank, Sedona finally broke and began to prattle in his cell. So he starts running his mouth. He starts telling a reporter that the money was given to political parties, sometimes under the table, and that they were traveling to South America and paying off people there. They were paying off Cubans, and that Calvi was with Gelli in basically trying to keep communism out of South America, which is their excuse for all of the bad things that they did. He also was talking about the Vatican's subversive attempts to gain control of Ambrosiano, but also about his involvement in the P2 Masonry. secret society and Gladio units. So alarm bells start sounding. The CIA immediately dispatches Carlo Rocchi, one of its Italian agents, to monitor Sedona's behavior in federal prison. He gains the mafia financier's trust by presenting himself with an affidavit from the Justice Department, basically saying he's a reliable person and there on behalf of President Reagan, who was preparing a full pardon for him. So basically, you've got the Department of Justice in bed with the CIA, lying to this prisoner to get him to shut up. Department of Justice. Sedona could not believe that something like that would be fake, so he takes the bait. He refrains from making any further statements to reporters. And when the U.S. Department of Justice issues an order for his extradition to Milan, upon hearing that, Sedona goes ballistic. If I finally get there, if no one does me in first, I'm going to talk about everything, and I'm going to make my trial a real circus. I'll tell everything. So Sedona is transported to a prison in Rome. Y'all know he's going to die, right? He's definitely going to die. They place him in a maximum security cell that had been the exact same cell that the Turkey guy that shot John Paul II was in. And he walked right out of it because they know everybody in the prison system. 5 days later, he's moved to a new maximum security women's prison as the only man in the prison. It's Supermax, not even 4 years old. Everything's electronic. They've got cameras on him. They're really watching this guy. He's still going to die. Sedona made contact with an American journalist who pens articles for the New York Times, Rolling Stones, and the Village Voice. When the reporter arrived, he begins to spill his guts. He spoke on matters that never had been before revealed to the press, including the U.S. government's protection of the drug trade and how it had allowed dirty money to accumulate in the hands of a few men. He also said that the President's Commission on Organized Crime functioned as a way of creating the crime, not doing away with it. So we know that, right? We know that all of the commissions that they set up, like the JFK murder one, it's just to hide it. It's not to actually solve it. It's a way of burying information. So Sedona, let's see. He added that such agencies often capture the middlemen in drug trade, but never the crime lords who had become the world's establishment. Sedona spoke of Gelly, the Masons, and the basically the strategy of tension. He's given up Gladio, and how they basically set up the Italian Communist Party to take the fall on everything, and how the U.S. Ambassador Martin and the White House had been involved in the Vatican money laundering. I mean, he's going for broke. The Pope's bank, the Vatican Bank, had been involved in such services since its founding, because we already tied the two together. In 1942, Gladio units began in Germany, and the Vatican Bank began in 1942. And we know that the Vatican Bank helped Hitler's Nazi senior staff escape through the, even gave them clergy clothes, and snuck them out through Egypt and Spain onto South America. So they were holding hands at that point. So he's basically spilling his guts about everything. So he didn't tell him everything, though. He held a little back because he still needed some leverage. He didn't talk about the interaction of the heroin trade with the Sicilian and the American mafia, and the ambassador Martin creating massive financial holes for the disappearance of billions in cash, the commissioning, the killing of Anne Brosoli, and how his whole kidnapping unfolded. So those are the things he's kind of holding back as leverage for his upcoming trial. So weeks before his trial, Sedona began to receive visits from particular P2 Masonic members, who no doubt reminded him once again of his oath to the lodge to maintain secrecy and not tell anybody about Gelly's. So they were basically saying, hey, we got Gelly out, and he was in a prison in Switzerland. So he went off to South America to hide. So they're telling him that basically, if you keep your mouth shut and you go through the trial, we'll get you out of jail once you get into prison under an actual sentence. So he begins to, he actually allows the court process to proceed without him even showing up in the courtroom. But it was granted, which is totally weird and unprecedented, actually. So during that trial, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But what's weird is the prosecutor says he's one of the most dangerous criminals in judicial history, but he only asked for 15 years in jail, and he gets 12. So Sedona's trial for the murder of the Brosoli began in 1985. It would drag on for 9 months, and basically the guy who he supposedly hired to make the hit had died from an alleged escape attempt from a New York jail. Sure. So that Roki guy, he's meeting with him, and he basically, Sedona says, I want to talk about the scandalous matters that constitute grave moral and penal irregularities that is happening to him in prison. So then the Roki guy, who's going to set him up, let the great battle against you know who begin, and let me have all of the necessary documents. So this is the guy that the DOJ has said on the up and up. So Sedona, not realizing he's a CIA agent, gives him all of his notes and all of his proof of the guilt of all of these people. And of course, that's not going to be seen again. So he's sitting in prison all fat, dumb, and happy, talking about by 1986 how, hey, the tortellini's great. I'm in jail. There's 3 television cameras installed in his solitary confinement cell. He can't do anything. There's a cadre of 12 guards that watch him all the time. His food is specially prepared in a special kitchen under strict supervision. So there's no way he's going to die, but he's going to die. So he basically gets up one morning in 1986 in March 20th. Isn't that one of them solstice things? I think it is. He carried the coffee cup with him to the door of the bathroom. Minutes later, he emerges from the bathroom. He had vomited all over himself. His face is convulsed in horror, and he said, they poisoned me. Those were his last words. He's rushed to the hospital. He's found in an irreversible coma from a lethal dose of potassium cyanide. So 48 hours later, the man known as St. Peter's banker was dead. His death was only to be expected. The Gladio agents possessed the key to every prison. They could manage the escape of Adka from a cell in Turkey and Gelly from a jail in Switzerland. They could arrange the jailhouse deaths of the arson guy from Steinbaum and General Santavito, who was the chief of military intelligence. And they could poison the coffee of a celebrated mafia guy who remained in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison. They're everywhere. The goodwill payment to Ambrosiano creditors from the coffers of Opus Dei did not close the file on the criminal probe of the bank collapse of Ambrosiano. So by February of 1987, the investigating magistrates conclude that the Vatican Bank had acted as an umbrella for Roberto Calvi, the guy that got hung, illicit transactions, and that it owned a substantial share of Banco Ambrosiano, as well as all of those dummy corporations that were set up for money laundering, and that it was responsible for the theft of $1.75 billion. So Italy's now getting serious. They issue arrest warrants for Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the former Chicago Archbishop, who is now the guy in charge of the Vatican Bank, Luigi Menini, and Pellegrino del Strobel. Those are all the top three guys in charge of the Vatican Bank. But no arrests were made because the Vatican pointed out that thanks to the treaty they signed in 1929 with Mussolini, y'all have no jurisdiction here and you're not going to touch any of these guys. So that goes to the Supreme Court in Italy, and they basically uphold the fact that there's not anything that you can do, which is very interesting since, there is a thing called extradition, but I don't guess we're going to do that with the Vatican, even though it's like on the street with Italy. So the Vatican bankers remain safe from extradition. Marcinkus received under papal he remained under papal protection until 1991, when he retired. And guess where he went? Sun City, Arizona. Because he's an American citizen. Italian authorities throughout the next decade attempted to persuade U.S. officials, the State Department, Department of Justice, those guys all about justice, to return the Archbishop to Italy so that he could face a jury trial. The U.S. Justice Department made a strange ruling that he possessed a Vatican passport. He's an American citizen and could not be extradited to Italy, even though his crimes took place on Italian soil. No one in the CIA wanted, they nicknamed him the gorilla, to testify in court about his Masonic ties, the Sicilian Mafia, or the transfer of all the funds to Solidarity, Gladio, or any of the other things, to include all their operations in Latin America that the Catholic Church had been part of. And so he stayed sheltered from justice within the Vatican City and then Sun City, Arizona, where he enjoyed a prestigious country club lifestyle, golf, expensive cigars, until he died of undisclosed causes in 2006. The pedophile that he was. In 1987, Galli, who basically had fled to, he had been arrested in Switzerland, was in a Swiss jail, and escaped to South America. He says he's at the end of his tether. He's got heart problems, so he surrenders after he negotiated his return to Italy to be charged only with financial offenses. And after serving less than 2 months behind bars, Galli complained of deteriorating health and was released on parole. In 1992, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison for his involvement in the Ambrosiano affairs, but it was later reduced to 12 years on appeal. The next 6 years, he remained under house arrest at his luxurious villa. Isn't that nice? In Tuscany. In 1998, they came to transport him to a public facility. Galli disappeared again. In the villa, police discovered 363 pounds of gold bars buried in a patio flower pots among geraniums and begonias. The Grand Master of the P2 Masonic Lodge had stolen the gold from Yugoslavian government while operating the rat lines for the Nazis. That was his compensation for ferrying out the Nazis. In the reorganization of the Vatican finances under Opus Dei that got underway in 1989, a 5-member supervisory board of lay experts was set up for the Vatican. Its president was Angelo Gallia, head of the bank within Italy. The vice president, there was a vice president, and then 3 other board members. Thomas Pritzker, not our guys, a guy from Deutsche Bank, and Thomas Maciose, Macioce, an American businessman. The new managing director of the Vatican Bank was going to be Giovanni Gladio, who was from a local bank. So Garofano, an Opus Dei supernumerary, served with one of those guys on the Vatican's Ethic and Finance Committee until 1993, when he was arrested in connection with a $94 million political kickback scheme. So, that's what people do when they're on the Ethic Committee. They do political kickbacks. They actually nicknamed this thing Clean Hands. The scheme involved the kickbacks of millions flowing through a Saint Serafino Foundation, an account Garofano set up at the Vatican Bank. So, basically they're still money laundering. And also, some of these members that were on this new board, that supposedly fixing all of the Marcinkus fiascos, are parts of the Knights of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which we also figured out is part of the whole problem, another secret organization, that they would, during their annual meetings, they would plan some of the Operation Gladio events. Also in that Military Order of Malta was Secretary of State Haig, CIA Director Casey, Treasury Secretary William Simon, Gelly, the former CIA Director John McCone, Prescott Bush Jr., George H.W. Bush, President Reagan's National Security Advisor William Clark, Deputy CIA Director General Vernon A. Walters, and the guy that founded the Safari Club. So you've got, and the Thomas Pritzker guy was a last minute ad because the guy who was originally supposed to be on there, Herman Abbs had been forced to resign from the committee due to the outcry from Simon Wiesenthal Center in LA, because he had actually been part of Hitler's banking system and a director on the IG Farben board, which we know was the big Nazi organization or company conglomerate, which owned the labor camps at Auschwitz. So Abbs was placed in charge of allocating funds for the Marshall Plan to German industries after he had already been involved in the whole German Nazi campaign. So that kind of ties all this stuff together, because you realize all of the Operation Gladio formed in Germany. So you've got the guy that was one of Hitler's bankers that's now coming to sit on this reformed Vatican Bank board. And again, he is part of the Military Order of Malta. Um, and so now you've got the finances of the Vatican Church in the hands of a secret Catholic society, this Opus Dei, that remained in the service of the CIA and the clandestine group of global economists. You just can't make this shit up. And so that's why, that's the end of what we're going to do today. But that's why when when we're talking on line on True Social and somebody goes, I just can't believe that a government such as Israel would kill their own citizens. I mean, they just have no idea. And I think it's our job to make sure that they understand that there's literally nothing these people are not capable of. I mean, they ground up a 15-year-old little girl in a meat grinder and dumped her in concrete, who had obviously been molested by somebody that was inside the Vatican. So there's literally nothing that they're not capable of. So please. All right. So what do we got going on here? Department of Injustice. I agree with that. Somebody mentioned that the other day too, about the name of the criminal justice system, because it does seem that the criminals are the only one that gets any benefit of the justice system by not being prosecuted. I thought that was ironic. Because, let's see, non-ethical committees. Yeah, it's crazy. So do we have, sounds like Epstein, you're so right. Do we have any questions about what we've gone over so far that we can talk about? Anything that y'all, anything else that y'all want to talk about? Let's make a deal. You're right. That's exactly what it's like. Read old books. Yeah, definitely read old books. And I'm big on actually buying the books. Let me see if I can show you guys. I don't know if you can see this, but I write all over my books. Whoever gets these books are going to be in trouble, which will be my kids, of course. But I underline everything. I make notes in the, like, yeah, they'll definitely be able to tell what their mom was thinking because I write notes in the corner, like, you're a liar, who's so-and-so's partners. You can see my Opus Dei notes in the corner. But because I do a lot of other research when we're like, that's the reason why I only wanted to take a couple of chapters at a time, because I have to do some pretty deep dives on some of these people to figure out where they all fit in the scheme. I also mentioned to asked y'all to watch that video that was talking about the Prescott Bush and how they were part of the whole German bank banking, and they're coming over and working for the Brown Harriman bank here, both Prescott Bush on the one side and the Walkers on the other side, and how that was all tied together. So hopefully y'all got a chance to listen to that, because that's stuff that I've all read before. We also, someone mentioned about the connections between the, I won't remember his name, the guy that was Bush Jr.'s business partner. Down, all I can remember is, I'm thinking of somebody else's name, but down in Houston and in Texas in general, when he was trying to do the oil company that never pumped any oil, deals and how that tied in with the House of Saud, because a lot of the Saudi Arabian wealth um, was they invested a lot of it in oil companies in Texas. And part of it's hard to map the overlap, but you had Howard Baker at the law firm in Houston that represented all of those deals. And then basically all of those same people ended up going to Washington as part of the Bush Jr. administration. So that was all very interesting. Um, and I think the Loftus guy did a great job of kind of tying all those pieces together. Yeah, the C-SPAN video. Thank you, Julie, for posting that, because that's an excellent. If you just watch that video, it does tie into all of this. What part of OG is in? So here's what I would say about the tie-in to Israel. So we know a couple of things about Israel. We know that they attacked the USS Liberty. We know that they have, which for those of you who don't know, I'd definitely go look that up. That's a U.S. ship that they spent about 48 hours surveilling and then bombed the hell out of it and killed a bunch of Americans, and then for 20 years lied about it. And once they finally admitted they did it, then they lied about the fact that, oh, we didn't know. Yeah, we did it, even though we said we didn't do it for 20 years. We definitely did do it, but we didn't know it was the U.S., even though you drove right by there in a boat that said USS Liberty on it. And you saw the U.S. flag. So, yeah, sure, you didn't know. In the multiple diving runs you did to surveil the ship before you bombed it. So, you definitely knew. Come on. And the fact that this is what boggles my mind. Israel has inserted spies throughout the United States and has been caught doing it. Y'all may know or may not know about Inslaw, the company that created anti-money laundering software. The Department of Justice, Injustice, as y'all appropriately pointed out, stole that software, never paid Inslaw for it ever. They were suing them for like 20 years, which suing the Department of Justice is, because we just can keep paying our taxes and fund the assault on our sovereignty of the Department of Justice. But anyway, so Inslaw has their software stolen. The DOJ gives it to the CIA and to Mossad. Both of them build separate backdoors to the software. And then that's what Epstein or Maxwell's dad was doing. Maxwell's dad traveled all over the world selling the Mossad version of that to unsuspecting countries, because with that software, they could track everybody else's money laundering, but nobody could track their money laundering. So by implication, they were money laundering. And so we are supposed to go out of our way, and they send billions of our tax dollars to Israel, where there has been a constant attack on the sovereignty of the United States, whether it was with spies or other things, by Israel on us. So, no, I firmly believe that the state of Israel is a Rothschild invented thing, and that it is not the group of people that God referred to as Israel. So it is a satanic imagery, idol, however you want to describe any of that. It is not what we're told it is at all. And so, no, I don't. It's not that I don't have sympathy for people dying. I do. I'm talking about the government and how it was created. It is a product of the Rothschilds' deal to fund World War I and World War II, and that was their gift by the British government for funding both sides of the war. And so I don't think anything good comes out of something like that. And I don't think in all of the years that Israel has been around as a government that they've not been a good ally to us. They've killed us. They've killed our Navy people. They've been involved in, like I said, money laundering, gun running. Um, they supplied Iran with weapons for decades. And now they have the audacity to say Iran's the state sponsor of terror when it's been Israel that was supplying them with weaponry. That's just crazy talk to me. I'm not saying Iran's a good person or country either, but please, please don't preach to me about being bad when you're involved in the same stuff. So that's my take on that. What else we got? Um, Okay, so I'm going to call it a night. I am going to try to get one out tomorrow morning so that we can get through the rest of this book. Because I definitely have a couple of very good ones in the wings that I want to work on next because they're going to rock your world. So I'm going to sign off for now. Thanks for being here, and hopefully I'll see you tomorrow, and I'll get out when we're going to do it tomorrow as soon as possible. Good night.